So there's been a lot of talk lately about being a cult expert, about cult experts coming on to speak on shows and things like that. Am I a cult expert? Who is a cult expert? What makes a cult expert, right? People have been calling me a cult expert. So let me tell you guys, oh, there's a cat in the background, see him? Let me tell you guys my opinion on this. I mentioned it on Twitter recently. Am I a cult expert? When I got into this field, when I got into YouTube, I started YouTube because I felt like nobody was really talking about atheism anymore. They were all talking about social issues and political issues. And I felt like I needed to fill the void that was there. So that's why I started. And I decided to lean heavily into atheist content. As time went on, I started to realize that something really fucked up happened to me when I was little, being a part of Jehovah's Witnesses, and that there was nothing okay about that. And I started wondering, like, what is it that brought me to the point where I could believe such absurd things? And why do people join later in life, like 28, 29, 30 years old, they join Jehovah's Witnesses, they join Mormonism when they didn't have a religious background at all? What brings them to that point? And why don't they leave once they do join? I kind of became obsessed with understanding the mindset, the psychology behind this. And during that time, I was going to school for substance abuse counseling, a psychology degree. It was a 2-year degree. So it's not an undergrad. Technically it's an undergrad, I think. Not a 4-year degree, it's a 2-year degree in substance abuse counseling. It gave me knowledge about the field of psychology that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I started really leaning into it on my YouTube channel and into my classes, studying about it. I watched as many videos and tapes and recordings, FBI recordings of Jonestown as I could, because I wanted to understand, I wanted to learn, I wanted to know what happened. I mean, I listened to the death tape from the FBI. What is it called? It's a death tape that Jim Jones recorded while the people were being forced to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. I listened to that tape beginning to end. I listened to the people crying. I listened to the babies screaming. I watched interviews from people who actually escaped Jonestown. I watched interviews from people who hid in the bushes from guards carrying around the shotguns looking for people to kill. I watched interviews from women who strapped their babies to their backs and walked through 30 miles of jungle to escape. I watched interviews of guards who weren't there on the compound when it happened, but still protected Jim Jones throughout that time. I watched all this stuff. I learned about all this stuff. I wanted to understand this stuff. I watched every indoctrination tape from Heaven's Gate, every single one that they put out. I watched every exit video. Right at the end of their lives, right before they died, they sat down in front of a camera like a few days before in pairs, two per video basically, and they gave their last messages to their family members. And I listened to it, every one of them. I listened to everything that every single one of those people had to say to their family before they died. I looked at the pictures of those people after they had actually done it. I read the FBI reports. One of my fans got the FBI reports through a Freedom of Information Act. The FBI turned the reports over to one of my fans, and they sent me the full report of everything that happened that day, beginning to end. 39 bodies found, the bags over their heads, the applesauce that they were eating, and what it was laced with, and the whole 9 yards. I even had the social security numbers of the people who died. I have looked at those pictures. I have read those stories. I have heard those people speak. Because I felt like it was important to understand how they got there. Felt like it was important to know so that we can avoid that kind of thing in the future. I've read an awful lot of books on this subject, and not just Stephen Hassan's books. I've read Rick Alan Ross's book. I have read studies from ICSA, International Occultic Studies Association. I've read their models. There is a lot more than just the bite model. There are multiple models, and some of them are used in court cases. I choose to use the bite model for very specific reasons, which I've detailed in videos before. My point is, I know a lot about how cults operate. And if somebody wants to call me an expert, they can call me an expert. I will not call myself an expert, though. And here are my reasons for that. I feel like the moment I start calling myself an expert is the moment that I start viewing myself as infallible. And I am not infallible. I could be wrong sometimes. In fact, I'm probably wrong about some stuff in some of my videos. Somewhere in there are errors. I'm sure of it, 100% sure, that somewhere in my video library there are errors. I don't know where, and if I did, then I would fix them. But I'm not right 100% of the time. I am not the most knowledgeable person in the field. And try as I might, I could never be the most knowledgeable person in this field because I've only been doing this for 3 or 4 years. I only have a 2-year degree in the field of psychology. I couldn't be the most knowledgeable person, but I do know a lot about this. So if somebody invites me onto a show as a cult expert, I will accept the title for that. Otherwise, I call myself a cult communicator. I don't call myself a cult expert. And if you guys call me a cult communicator, I'm more than happy accepting that. That really is what I am. I'm just a cult communicator. I know a lot about the subjects, and I talk about it on a regular basis, and I do my own analyses, but that does not necessarily make me an expert.
Hi, Owen. It's Navadia. I just wanted to know, are there any points in the bite model that are more significant in others in regards to undue influence?
That's a good question. Let's take a look at the bite model real quick and see. I believe so. And let me explain how the bite model is structured and why some of these things are more significant, okay? I talked about this in a video that released recently on my main channel. Behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. Those are 4 categories, right? The reason that it's those 4 and not something else is because those are the 4 ways in which people will reach out for help to reestablish their authentic identity when a cult is trying to program a cult identity into them. So, for example, if you're trying to control people's behavior by exploiting them financially, by controlling their clothing and hairstyle, by telling them where and with whom they can live, you'll reach out in emotional ways. You'll want to talk to friends and family. You may be looking for happiness outside of the group. If they try to withhold and distort information or forbid you from talking to ex-members or critics, you're going to try to reestablish your own identity. Start looking outside the group for other information. You're going to be reaching out to friends. You're going to be thinking to yourself, is this true? You're going to start questioning it. That's the point. So these 4 categories, if you control somebody's behavior, then this one is going to pop up and they're going to start acting out emotionally. If you try to control their information, they're going to start thinking about what's happening to them. That's kind of the idea behind the BITE model. You have to control these 4 aspects of a person's life if you want to maintain control of them completely without risk of them escaping the situation that they're in. So there are some really key points under each section that are really, really relevant. Like if you can hammer down on these things and make sure that people are being obedient to these things, then you got them for life. Under behavior control, modifying behavior with rewards and punishments, that is the one for behavior control. You're trying to program in a cult personality. If you can manage to program in a cult personality with rewards and punishments, you've got them for life. That's really the main point for behavior control. Under thought control, black and white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. That would be the main one. And also one that I added, which is placing exaggerated importance on events or ideas. I don't know that cults specifically set out to do that, but it is a byproduct of a cult. Absolutely no question about it. Under information control, this one is all about controlling a narrative. So you don't want people hearing the bad things that are being said about a cult. In fact, you only want people hearing good things about the cult. You only want people hearing what the cult has to say, and that's it. That's really what information control is about, ultimately, is narrative construction and control. I guess if I had to pick one of these, I would say deliberately withhold and distort information is probably the main point on information control. And under emotional control, I would say shunning if you disobey or disbelieve is one of the main points under emotional control. If a group is discouraging, not even necessarily shunning, but discouraging you from talking to friends or family who disobey or disbelieve, then it's almost certainly a cult. Those are really the 4 main points, I would say. Shun you if you disobey or disbelieve. Controlling a narrative, which technically isn't under information control, but we'll call it deliberately withhold and distort information. Instilling black and white, us versus them, and good versus evil thinking. And modifying behavior with rewards and punishments. Those are the 4 ways that cults primarily control people. In addition to that, to be a cult, in my opinion, you have to have a hierarchy, a leadership that is enforcing these things. A leadership that is telling you should not talk to family members who don't believe it anymore. A leadership who is deliberately withholding and distorting information and controlling a narrative. A leadership that is instilling black and white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. And a leadership who's modifying your behavior with rewards and punishments to program a cult identity into you and replace your authentic identity with the cult identity. In my opinion, that's what is required to be a cult. But there's this really interesting phenomenon where people take on the characteristics of a unified group exactly like a cult. Exactly like a cult does. With no leadership. That's what I call a cult-like mindset. I feel like that name doesn't really do it justice. At some point I may come up with a more apt name for it. I don't know. But a good example of that would be the Flat Earth movement. There are leaders in the Flat Earth movement, but they don't really enforce a cult-like mindset like Jehovah's Witnesses do. It's not a unified group that controls things like that. But the group is still unified. In a lot of ways. There's just no leadership to it. So I would call that a cult-like mindset right now. But I'm gonna come up with a better name for it at some point in the near future. Thank you so much for calling in with that. It was extremely useful. An extremely useful question to answer.